Welcome everybody to the semi-final round of the 2010 Hart IB. We're a year debating the motion that this House would employ affirmative action for male educators. Representing this motion, the team on first propositions, Queens EW. Representing the team on first opposition, Queens VH. Second proposition, the team from Alaska. Second opposition, the team from McGill. My name's Ian Freeman. I'll be your chair for this round. We have a pretty awesome panel going Richard, Anissa, Nick, Mikey, Monica, and Steven. We're all pretty great. I'd like to call forward the Prime Minister, Wudi Wu, to defend the motion that stands in his name.
Very simple with our model here today. We think it's very clear today. We're going to set this in the U.S. in public schools like elementary, middle school, and high school. We're going to say that the system should seek, incentivize, and hire males even if they are slightly less qualified than female teachers. I think it's fairly simple. We have three main constructive points to bring to you here today, Mr. Speaker. One is sort of the educational perspective and the benefits that fall under those umbrellas. And the second is the social perspective and why there's benefits under that perspective. And the third thing, why affirmative action in this specific instance is justified and is okay. So first I want to talk about the educational benefits in that perspective, right? First of all, recognize, Mr. Speaker, that males and females do think differently, right? They also teach differently and they learn differently, right? So a very clear point of view, inherently you can't have a male teacher and a female teacher teaching the same way and relating and teaching their students in the exact same way, right? You can't reach out and affect those students in the same way, right? Under that, Mr. Speaker, there's sort of the benefits from a student's perspective perspective to being educated by a male teacher specifically, or a female teacher. We think also that there's sort of in the lower levels, especially not at this moment, in the lower levels of the education system, we think that it's female dominated, right? And that there are a lot more female teachers. I think it's 25% only are male, right? So that's one problem, right? We think furthermore, Mr. Speaker, another sort of external problem is that only in sort of the higher levels of education, like universities, are a lot of the teaching staff dominated by males, right? We think a lot of the students in public school systems, elementary, middle, and high school, don't actually go on to those higher levels of education. So they don't actually ever get exposed in a lot of cases to those male teachers, to those male role models, right? We think a lot of kids don't get that. We think that's bad. We also think, Mr. Speaker, when you have a system, we think when you have both genders very prominent within a school system, you have children who are better able to relate to teachers that match, say, their own interests, their own learning style, their own sort of gender style, things like that, Mr. Speaker. I think those are very clear educational benefits, I'm taking a minute, that are sort of why we need more male teachers in a system that is predominantly dominated by females.
But how do you address the fact that males already have a huge advantage of being hired because there's so few of them, and they're so much more likely to be hired to become principals, to become leaders within the school system?
Right, okay, so just because they're more, I don't really see the relevance of that, and it sort of plays into our point, right? In that you just admitted that we really want male teachers, which is what we're here to prove, Mr. Speaker, right? We would just say if we just make it clear that we are more than willing to hire male teachers and willing to perform for affirmative action in this instance, we think we would just get more male teachers. That's what kind of I stand on this side of the house. Secondly, I want to talk about sort of from a more social perspective, in terms of the school system, society in general, why this sort of affirmative action really benefits the entire sort of system. First, I want to talk about sort of stigma between these two genders, right? Recognize, Mr. Speaker, that there is a lot of stigma with regards to sort of males and a nurturing, caring role, right? That traditionally in society, it's viewed as females having more of those sort of that fit better into those sort of roles, right? Teaching students, teaching children, raising them, nurturing them along their path to growth, right? We think there is that sort of social stigma, which also creates, in a sense, sort of a vicious cycle, right? That's why we're in this situation today, that's why we're in the status quo, is because there is that cycle of just society viewing males as sort of being less nurturing, being less filling into sort of a caring role, and as a result, less males tend to go in, right? So when we try and incentivize those males to become, and through affirmative action, to go into the school system more so, Mr. Speaker, we think we can get a lot of benefits with regards to that, right? We think we get a lot of, we think we sort of, in a way, combat the social stigma in that way by trying seeking more male models, right? We think that it really sort of tries to address sort of the gender equality issues within something, within something like the public school system, right? We're in a situation where there's a lot of female teachers and not a lot of male teachers. By seeking affirmative action, we can right that wrong, and I'll get into more specifically why we are able to impose affirmative action in this situation.
It's not stigma, it's the opposite case of offshore oil drilling. Men are just not as interested.
We think the stigma response to that is you just have, that's why you have more affirmative action. That's why you make it easier for males to get hired. You give them more incentives to get hired, right? We don't think, we really don't get the relevance of that POI, right? They're really admitting that, we just need more male teachers. We are fine with getting more male teachers. They admit there's a problem. We propose to solve that problem. We don't really see the point here, right? The other thing I want to talk about under the social perspective, Mr. Speaker, is this. Recognize that in a lot of cases in the States, especially in regions like inner city regions and school systems, there is a significant lack of a male role model in their homes and in their families, right? Recognize, Mr. Speaker, that not every family is a perfect nuclear family with a mother figure and a father figure. And that in a lot of these areas there is that lacking of that, right? And because of how much time a child in elementary or middle or high school spends in the school system, we think it's therefore imperative for society to say that you need and you should have a male role model who you can look up to as someone who cares for you, cares about your success, cares about your personal growth, and moreover is successful and is someone you can look up to and look forward to being, right? We think that's another social issue that's very important in this round, one that's sort of Kai and I are trying to address through this policy, right? We also want to talk about one last thing under sort of the social issues that what it also gives a benefit to for these children, Mr. Speaker, is seeing a lot more male to female social interaction in adults, right, in their school system. When you have a more even balance of male teachers and female teachers in a school system, you have more cross-gender interactions that are in public amongst these adult figures, right? You have male and female teachers more so cooperating on things, asking each other for help, things like that, right? We think that's also very important, especially in these regions that are more troubled, right? As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, we think it's very good from a social perspective to have lots of examples for these kids to see of males and females, adults, interacting positively, which they may not have at home, Mr. Speaker. That's something very important I want to distinguish here. want to talk about, Mr. Speaker, is sort of this concept of why when affirmative action and discrimination is okay, right? First of all, we think society, like when there's sort of a very special and clear need for a certain segment of a population that isn't represented in some sort of system, right? We think that is definitely the case here, as both teams have admitted, right? There's a clear shortage of male teachers. We think in that case that fulfills one of those criteria for that, right? We think there's also has to be a harm, which we tried to show you today in terms of there's a harm that these children are not being educated to the full extent of the school system's potential, and a social harm in terms of these stigma, in terms of these values, in terms of their lacking male role models, right? We think furthermore that there's clear benefits of this sort of affirmative action, which we would say, like I've already announced it, right? Moreover, what I want to say is this, right? We don't think that sort of like all affirmative action has to relate to some sort of past harm, right? We think when there's a current status quo harm, it's okay to apply affirmative action. It doesn't have to be to right a past wrong, right? And that we think there's a lot of current harm. We think government can bring these issues to light in terms of if there's a lack of male like balance equality in the school system. If there's a lot of pro-feminist movements and there's not enough like highlight on male issues, we think the government can use this sort of thing to highlight and bring those things into the spotlight, right? So we don't think it has to do with past wrongs. We think in the current situation, when we've proven that there's a clear harm and there's a clear benefit to this action, we're fine with imposing and implementing an affirmative action law. For those reasons, we're very proud of the proposal.
Thank the Speaker for his remarks, and I'd like to call upon Adam Hetherington to open the nomination.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about when do we positively discriminate, I want to talk about resentment, and I want to talk about what the market solves. So these are my three things. And I'm going to tell you, before that, I want to get into a Wudi talk. Because Wudi comes up here and he makes a lot of assertions, right? He just sort of throws things against the wall and says that men intrinsically teach men better, but he never tells us why. He then asserts that men are better role models for men, but never tells us why. And so we're missing a lot of causal links from Wudi's speech, and we think those are rather important. And the problem with that, Mr. Speaker, is he uses those sort of benefits that he has never proven to justify his positive discrimination, and we don't think they've done enough job of actually doing that. So that's sort of what we're looking from first off, right? From first off now. So let's get into when do we think we discriminate positively. We think that we discriminate positively to sort of correct a wrong that exists within the system, right? We think that we do that, notable examples would be quota systems within American universities for African American students, because we believe that through socioeconomic policies, we have disadvantaged this group such that they don't have a fair shake when it comes to getting a position, right? The difference here, Mr. Speaker, is not that there is past discrimination against men. Wudi even admitted that. The difference here is a lack of interest, Mr. Speaker, and they've never addressed why some sort of positive discrimination is going to address that sort of cultural lack of interest, Mr. Speaker. More to the point, we're going to tell you why we think it's damaging. We also think you can positively discriminate if there's active discrimination imbued within the system today, right? And that doesn't happen, Mr. Speaker. We think that people, will hire someone based on their competency. They don't look at a man. We certainly never heard any reasons as to why you look at a male who wants to be a primary teacher as someone who is less competent as an individual. More to the point, we posit the fact of the glass elevator, right? That men naturally rise within the system faster than women do. So we think that's actually one of the reasons why you see a lot of men actually in charge of school systems, because they come through and move through rather well. So we don't think there's actual discrimination imbued with being a teacher, because these people have been moved up the system such that they control school boards, such that they're principals of schools. So we don't think that that's inherent in the system, so we don't think that there's grounds for that. We think that actually leads to certain harms. Now the problem becomes, if you have to change these cultural norms through positive discrimination, we think you have to offer a hell of a lot more incentives than Wudi led on to. And we think that's problematic, Mr. Speaker, because that ultimately negates the quality of education that people are going to be receiving. Because people now, if they realize, you have to put really strong incentives to change someone's mind, to change a cultural understanding. We think you're going to get people who are doing it because of these incentives, Mr. Speaker, not because they're interested, not because they're competent. We think that ultimately harms education at the base level. We think that you have to understand what we're messing with, Mr. Speaker. We're messing with something that develops a child for the rest of their life. We think you want the most competent individual possible to have that child develop in the most positive space possible. We think that you damage that system when you provide incentives that are simply too strong. More to the point, we think the system fundamentally says there's merit in being a man, right? Like, men have a lot of advantages in pretty much every other field, and it now comes to education, saying if you are a man, you are better off. There's something good about being a man. Intrinsically, you are better. We think that's incredibly problematic to imbue in people that, Wudi talked about, we want to give people positive images of both genders. I don't think you're going to do that when you say you're a man, therefore you're better off. You're a man, therefore you deserve special treatment. I think that's problematic. Go ahead.
When you say we need more incentives to get more male teachers, that's kind of like affirmative action.
Right, I'm saying those incentives are too strong, Wudi, so you get crappy teachers and then more crappy people at the end of the system, right? So let's talk about resentment, because I think it's going to happen within the system. Because women already, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of belief, particularly in sort of corporate structures, that men have an easier time, men rise faster. There's a belief that the system is biased against women. We see that in things like pay differentials. What I think is, if you put this into a school system, it creates the idea that the system is pro-male, even though they've already seen a lot of men rise through the ranks of the administration. We think this changes several different things. First of all, we're going to say it doesn't create a happy working environment, Mr. Speaker. We think that teachers are and their interactions with students are fundamentally products of their environment. If you enjoy your job, if you believe you are being treated fairly, we think you're going to do a better job teaching individuals than if you hate your job, if you feel the system is turned against you. We think that's problematic. More to the point, we think it decreases interaction between individuals because you resent that person for taking a job because fundamentally they're a man. We think particularly in primary and elementary education where kids rotate around in different classes, you're a better teacher if you understand what every kid is doing in other classes, right? You can interact with other teachers and get a holistic sense of the child's education in things like science and things like English. That allows you to teach them better, Mr. Speaker. We think that you lose the ability to have some of that interaction. We think that's problematic. No. So last thing I want to talk about why we think the market solve. People ultimately respond to incentives, and we think that people buy into a meritocracy as a just system. People believe that it is fair. People believe that it produces just outcomes. We also think that the meritocracy that we're talking about means that people who compete for a position ultimately give us the best possible result, and therefore have the best possible platform to teach students. We think that's good. We think that people value this system, and in order to break it, you have to provide a massive harm, right? We're talking like slavery, Mr. Speaker, is a justification for affirmative action. Because I think when people don't believe that they have a fair shake at things, I think that hurts the way that they interact with the state. I think that's fundamentally damaging. So what did Wudi talk about? Wudi said males learn better by men. But he never said why, Mr. Speaker, and he never told us why women can't teach men. We think that's fundamentally problematic. No, thank you. He says that we need more male role models. I think this sort of entrenches the fact that only men get men, and only men can ever teach a man to grow up and develop properly. I think that's problematic. We need to hear some rationale as to why that's going to be the case. Then he says, look, there's social stigma, right? Men don't want to go into these positions because of this social stigma. He doesn't do anything then to address that problem with his model, right? All we do is we just put, hopefully we put worse people in these positions. We think that's fundamentally problematic. Also, it doesn't really address sort of the social stigma of women who are generally in caring and nurturing roles, right? We see more women as nurses. We see more women as primary caregivers. We think that that's sort of just how things have shaken out culturally because it's what people want to do. We're totally okay with that. Then he says, look, there's a harm because these people aren't being benefited, so we need to overhaul the system. We think he's never really given us any sort of concrete benefits. He's never told us why these benefits are going to occur. That's fundamentally problematic. He says there's discrimination inherent with the system. We've never heard any talk of this discrimination. We've given you plenty of analysis as to why people simply aren't interested, right? We think it's sort of people culturally believe that they want to go off and want to do other things. That's fine. That's totally acceptable. If you want to say that we're going to change who's teaching our children, Mr. Speaker, you have to talk about how you're going to change those cultural norms. They haven't done that, Mr. Speaker. We stand very proudly off of it.
Thanks, Speaker, for his remarks. I'd like to call to floor Kaya to close the first half of the proposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to talk about, I'm going to bring one new point to the round. This idea that males are not interested in, on this side of the house, we say we don't care if males are interested. Whether it be for social, the vicious cycle, whether it be just inherently genetic. We don't care if they're interested in these jobs. We want to incentivize them to be in these jobs because they're the benefits we've shown you on this side of the house, and I'll go back to reveal those. And then I'll deal with what we heard from Adam so far today. So why are we not interested in whether or not males, either because of the vicious cycle that we talked about, or because they'd rather be like doing other jobs, like being on oil rigs and whatnot? Why does that not matter to this side of the house? We don't care because we think it benefits the children, their education, and their social growth. And we think that that's incentive enough for us to not force them, like it seems Adam thinks we're going to do, like making you become a male teacher, but incentivizing you such and discriminating, like a positively affirmative action, putting you in those areas because it will benefit the children in the way enumerated. So when I say this, like we don't care, we want to incentivize you to do that, and we think that that's problematic. What we heard from Adam was like, if you incentivize these people so much because they don't want to do it, then you'll have bad teachers. We don't think that's true. We think a lot of jobs are incentivized, whether it be monetarily, such as lawyers, and that doesn't make lawyers who do jobs because they want the money or because they're incentivized to have that job for whatever benefits they get, a bad person in that position, right? Mr. Speaker, we think that that's a logical thought. We think that people are incentivized to do a lot of different things for a lot of different reasons. I'll take you a second, Megan. And we don't think that that's actually going to inherently make them bad at their jobs.
But would you have, like, women paid much less than men in order to make more men do work?
Okay, but that's not the argument. The argument is that Adam said any form of incentivization makes someone take a job that they're going to be bad at. I'm just giving you an example of how there are other incentives, such as monetary incentives, and that doesn't necessarily make you bad at your job. We're saying whether that incentive is going out and like seeking you out and maybe giving you a job where you're like a little less qualified than the female or whatever like scenario you want to bring forward, we think it's an ideological debate. We think that that's okay, but we don't think it's going to make you worse at your job. So he talked about, what did Adam talk about? He talked about like positive discrimination, and he said it's correct or wrong that we saw in society in the past. And Wudi actually preemptively dealt with that. We'd say that there's a wrong happening right now, why don't we correct that? And the wrong that we see in this side of the house is that males and females, regardless of like their gender as children, will benefit from having male role models. Wudi never got up and said that only men can learn from men and only women can learn from women. We'd say that females benefit from having positive role models if they don't have a father in their life, if they don't see successful males. We say everyone benefits, regardless of gender, of seeing equal gender, having equal opportunity for those role models. That's what we stand for on this side of the house. He talked about like this idea that there wasn't passive discrimination. We don't care if there's discrimination now, or we've shown you positive reasons why we should implement this policy. We think that like falls on our side of the house. He talked about like cultural norms and this idea that like women are usually discriminated against, and they'll be upset if you start discriminating against them in the school systems. We'd say that on this side of the house, and this is an interesting idea, is that we don't talk enough about discrimination that happens against males. We don't talk enough about like social norms or things that stop men from being in positions that they might actually want. Adam asked for like, why is this a vicious cycle? Why is this happening? We would say because when you're in first or second or third grade as a male and you don't see any male teachers, that's the vicious cycle that's created. You don't see that you can have this position, or it's a legitimate position, or that it's something that you want to do because you don't notice other people. That's the justification, that's the vicious cycle that is created. So we think by putting people in those positions, it stops males from thinking that that's not a job they can have because they've seen or had a really successful male kindergarten teacher, and they want to do that in their future. So what else did we hear from Adam? He said it's not a happy environment because like these females will feel like they were discriminated against, and then everyone doesn't like everyone, and it's a bad idea. What we'd say is that the females who are in the school system weren't affected by discrimination. It's the people who didn't get the job who are going to be kind of pissed off. We don't think it really affects the environment that much, so we think we're like okay with this. So I want to move forward to what we heard from Wudi and the inadequate response we heard from Adam. So the first thing that Wudi talked about was like education, and this is something that's screwed by opposition. Men and women do think differently. Thankfully, as a science major, I know that this is true, right? We have different systems in our brain that make us think in different ways, right? And then ignore this on this side of the house. What Wudi was saying is that, like, it's true that women think in a more holistic way and men think in a more straightforward way. We say that this is going to be different and make people teach differently. We think that the benefit of having these two different thinking methods for everyone, whether or not they finally get to university to have that male role model, is important and will change the level of education. We think that also, it's like you see that education is important to males, like if you're a young male and you don't see any male teachers, then you think that maybe men don't really value education, right? Because they haven't taken on that role. We think that when you have male teachers, you see that men equally value education as a woman would, and we think that that's why we might see like young women doing much better in elementary school, middle school, and high school, and then at university levels, that's when guys start to succeed. Might be a correlation between what kind of role models you're seeing and where people are doing well, right? So we think that that's from that. The second thing we talked about, and I'll take you in a second. Actually, I'll take you now.
Okay, so none of these differences are innate. You can teach people in Teachers College to be aware of these differences and how to respond to them, whether you're a male or a female.
Okay, we say that that's just not going to happen. That's not every teacher is going to get the proper teaching to learn how to change how their brain thinks, right? We just don't think it's realistic or practical. So the second thing we talked about, and we talked about, is the social idea. We think it's actually really important because what you're seeing in elementary schools and in middle schools is people spending a lot of time with role models that will affect them. The social benefit is having the male role model. The social benefit is seeing people interact both male and female. Like I said before in the opening of my speech, it's really important for women to have male role models as well, and that's something that they haven't heard or dealt with on this side of the house. We also talked about a lot of people, and it's just a reality situation, don't have dads, and we think it's beneficial for them to have this kind of positive interaction. Wudi also talked about positive male and female interactions between faculty, respectful interactions, and we think that's socially beneficial. We think that when you are growing up or making you feel more comfortable dealing with male, regardless of gender, we think that's important. So I think that on this side of the house, we've really shown you all the positive benefits that are really reaped for the education and the social growth of our children. What we haven't seen in opposition is any real reason not to incentivize these things, not to get males into our school system, and whatnot. But all we really heard from opposition was that the market solves. Obviously, the market is not solving and has not solved. Therefore, we don't think that's true, right? We think that word simply falls because it's not the case. We think that when we see teachers, one guy go into the school system and become the head person, that means he's that position. It not means he's in the classroom teaching the teachers, right, Mr. Speaker? We don't have enough people going in. We don't have enough people going in because we do have this vicious cycle, and we think that regardless of whether or not there was a past harm, regardless of whether or not this might whatever, we think that it's beneficial enough to our children to really want to do this. And so finally, I just want to end with this idea that we don't talk enough about male problems or male issues, and we think that this is actually a good social thing to actually talk about how it really is important to talk about how there aren't enough male role models in the school system, that we don't value the education of the school system, and we support that in this kind of house. We also support feminism and all the good stuff that comes with that, but we're showing in this particular case that males are often underrepresented, and for that we're proud to propose.
Thank you, Speaker, for remarks. I'd like to call the floor next to close the first half of the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So first I'm going to look at one more issue in this debate, but address what Kai said and tell you why what Adam said still makes sense in this round today. So firstly, I want to address this problem of whether or not men and women actually think differently, and are these actual huge differences in how they actually affect the school system if they do exist. We think that the problems associated with the school system in terms of boys being engaged in the school system are related to the gender of the people that are teaching them. We think these teachers work within an institution, and that institution is what creates problems a lot of the time. When you're talking about a lack of role models, when you're talking about a lack of men entering the system, let's look at how this is structured, Mr. Speaker. If you want to become a teacher, you're entering into a job where there's almost no upward mobility. You're entering into a job where you're going to be in the same job for the next 40 years of your life. We think for the case, for a lot of men, this isn't a job that's attractive. It isn't a job that they're going to want to enter. That's why the men that do enter the school system are the ones who are the most upwardly mobile, who take the most leadership positions. So we think it's negative when you have, when you're trying to create an incentive, when there's already an incentive for men to enter this, the men already have an incentive not to join the system because of the way it's structured, because of the way that it's not something that's attractive to someone who's been told all of their life as a male that to be ambitious, to try and get a career that is actually going to have a lot of advancement. Women are told throughout their whole lives, oh, you would be a good teacher. We don't think changing this by adding these incentives changes those cultural norms. They haven't told us why this is different. So they haven't showed this link between policy and results. What did we hear from Kaya? She said that males don't need to be interested in this in order to take advantage of these incentives. We think this is really negative. Mr. Speaker, there's a huge surplus of people who want to be teachers. There's a huge number of people in America who go to teachers college and aren't able to get a job for 5 to 10 years. We think that's really problematic, Mr. Speaker, because what you're doing is you're having all of these women who've been been educated and trained to be teachers who aren't able to be teachers, who are fully qualified, but just because there's a small number of males, these people automatically get jobs. We think that undermines the meritocracy. It undermines the thought that women actually have an equal ability to get these jobs. Because we think a lot of the time women are the ones being negatively discriminated against in this system. They're the ones who actually don't get jobs because people think there need to be more males within the school system, but because of these cultural things we've talked about. But we think that that women will actually see this as negative, they'll see that men are being advantaged, and then they'll feel discriminated against within the system. This is a bad thing, Mr. Speaker.
You're saying in a career with no upward mobility, females thrive and males don't. What
No,
we're saying is, why don't we change that perspective socially?
I think the structure is such that there is no upward mobility. I think women have been told that these are jobs that are good, like that they would be suited for. And I don't think the point is to be able to tell males you should enter a job where you're going to get $40,000 for the rest of your life, you're never going to make more money. So I think like social structure tells males, and we can't change that, but like they're giving them slightly more money. You're not going to be able to change like this huge system through one small policy. So we think that there's benefit, they told us there was benefit for more male role models. They never told us why we can't have role models in places other than the school, why women can't be role models to men, why to males, why any of these things exist. So we think it's an even economic incentive that hurts women. No, thank you. We think there are already way too many teachers. This creates huge amounts of resentment. And then we heard that it's a vicious cycle because men don't see other men within the school system. But we don't think it will be effective in changing this vicious cycle. We think the small number of males who do go to the, do react to these incentives won't be enough to change like the massive number of women who are interested in becoming teachers. So we also think that because of this, we don't think it can possibly make the huge difference that they're talking about. It's just simply not possible to address these things through a policy like this. So what did we hear from Adam? How is it not addressed? Firstly, no thank you. We asked when should positive discrimination be used and when is it effective? They said we should use positive discrimination when there's a clear need and someone is not represented. We don't think this is true, Mr. Speaker. We think positive discrimination is a huge is a huge step because it does negatively discriminate against the other group. The group is not included. So we think you need positive, the only time you can really use positive discrimination is in order to address things like negative discrimination, in order to address problems that are systematic and that the government has disadvantaged this group. We don't think this is the case with males. We think that males often just have the ability to go into jobs, like they're told to go into a job, and they're paid much more. We could raise the salary for all teachers, even women, and then you might have more males enter the school system because they can respond to that economic incentive. I don't think we should make only men be able to be paid more to be teachers. So I think if you just say universally, it would have the same effect without this discrimination they're talking about. No, thank you. So we think that this doesn't address this, the stereotypes and the problems that we have with men in the school system. Then we talked to you about about resentment, how this will create resentment among female teachers. We think there's merit, it's good to have a meritocracy within the school system because all of these people have to work together in a work environment. It's really problematic when you think your coworkers are only there because of their gender. When you realize your coworkers are being paid much more than you because of their gender. That's why we think things like discrimination in other fields regarding women are bad because the people around women are doing the same jobs as them, but they're being paid much more. You're simply replicating this within the school system. So we think this causes resentment. We think women already have a harder time against males because of stereotypes that it's good to have males in the school system. They haven't shown to us why this is inherently beneficial. Thirdly, we told you that the market solves. We think that people buy into meritocracy as a just system, and because we value merit, there's massive harms to breaking it because it hurts these interactions between people. We think schools are inherently a social environment, one where teachers have to interact with children and they have to interact with each other. If you have people there simply because of an economic incentive, and they're going to, they've said, we need to have a huge economic incentive for this to actually work. Because of the huge problems that are working, the huge cultural problems in the other direction. So you have females that are paid much less, males that are paid much more. We think this is a massive harm to the system. It hurts the way you interact with children. It hurts teachers interacting with each other, which hurts the way children perceive them. And for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, I would like to oppose.
whether or not they actually believe negative discrimination doesn't exist in the status quo. Because if we can prove to you, imposing on government, that there is inherent discrimination within the hiring process that enables males from becoming educators equal to that of females, we win on this side of the house, and everything I said does not hold weight. That is our extension today. We're going to prove to you how discrimination will change cultural norms. I'll discuss the inherent discrimination that exists in the system and explain to you how we change that best through the educational process. Before I do that, a little rebuttal. We get first an idea of meritocracy best creates the best educators. If that's the case, Mr. Speaker, then why do 30% of American students not graduate from high school? Why is education failed so much? I don't believe the competitive market has actually created good quality education for our students. Therefore, I don't believe we should support meritocracy any further. I'm leaving that alone. Now, it can also tell us that the only justification we have for positive discrimination is something with negative discrimination. I'll address this when I construct the matter, I promise. And lastly, the only negative impact they have in today's debate is that we're going to have resentment. Well, I think when we desegregated the blacks from the whites in America, we had a lot of resentment. Yes, but you know what? The social change we got at the end of this process was better for society because we integrated social norms, we changed that concept. We're willing to take that fault on our side of the bench in the name of social change. No, thank you. So, with that being said, I'm going to move straight into my positive matter. First of all, how do we change cultural norms? We think the change that has to occur for cultural norms comes from repetitive, positive interactions with those we're trying to exemplify as being positive role models. The problem, however, in the status quo is when you're exposed to predominantly female teachers, you're going to naturally assume that it's female teachers who are doing a better job because that's what you've been exposed to. So you create a negative feedback loop that reinforces the idea that females are naturally better teachers. And this manifests itself in the hiring process when we look to what kind of educators we want to have. That's problematic. Whether or not we like to accept it, we are constantly in a battle of sexes. We constantly judge women against men in both the educational arena and other arenas as well. And this is what happens in education when you naturally prefer women and allow them to become the majority that teaches within a school system. So, how do we then stop this? Well, first of all, you have to stop inherent discrimination. And it's implicit in the system. It's not explicit the way that African Americans separate against those of the white majority, but it's very implicit. We've maybe been alluded to on their bench the idea that sometimes we look at females as nurturing beings. Sometimes we look at them as emotional beings who can better take care of our children, as babysitters or daycare people. And that's why we put them in roles of elementary school leadership, because we understand that they can see that women are viewed as naturally more nurturing, and therefore, from the hiring process, those qualities we define as being a good teacher naturally select women. The discrimination is inherent. And that in itself manifests itself in the way women become the majority of educators in elementary systems versus the university systems. Look at the way we differentiate the ratios from an elementary basis to a university basis. In the elementary processes, I'll get to in a minute, we prefer those who are emotional, nurturing beings. We naturally believe them to be women because we have this screen on our eyes because women can't be logical, they can't be rational in the same way men can. Whether or not that's true is irrelevant. The fact of the matter is that's the perception society has created for 300 years and has led to the corporate discrimination basis conflate with educational discrimination. Now, go to the university where we value rational, logical teachers, and what do you get? Professors who are male, more often than female professors. The problem is education is failing. Consider what happens if we reverse this priority list. If we allow for logical, rational teachers to be the preferred species or the preferred method in elementary systems versus allowing the emotional beings to the university system, we probably have smarter children by grade 6 than we do right now because we prioritize it in a different way. Now, I'm not saying men and women are these categoricals, but the fact of the matter is, when we perceive them to be, we naturally discriminate in our hiring process. Why are more men administrators? Because we have degrees towards administration that men choose to partake in, not because they actually become educators first and then move up the ladder. That's not analogous to what we're discussing in today's debate. It doesn't exist. Before I move on a little bit at this point, I'll go ahead and take you, sir.
So if we really have these notions, then why do we now see more women going to university than men, and more women becoming professors than before?
Affirmative action. Positive incentives leads to social change. Did I say more? I apologize now. Okay. So where have we seen this at work in the past? Look at the opera. Even though now in today's realms we see women more valued as operatic singers than men, previous to those sort of discrimination practices, maestros would constantly choose men to be the role leads within their societies. And what happened as a result? Well, they said, no, we're not being biased, men are just better singers. What did the opera companies start to do? We audition, not knowing whether you're a male or a female. What happened after that? Women were more likely to be chosen 30% of the time than they had been before those screens were in place. What does this tell you about human psychology? We are naturally discriminatory. We naturally make assumptions about the way we view women and men. That leads to implicit discrimination in our hiring processes, even in modern society. And that's problematic. You know, you didn't take me, but go ahead.
If that's the case and we need to break this negative feedback loop, then why don't we have affirmative action for women in things like engineering and banking, where men are seen as dominant because they're men?
Did you miss the analysis where I told you men are more valued as logical, rational beings? It seems to me that that in itself is why we have more men in engineering roles, when women probably need affirmative action in that. The problem with opening opposition in today's debate is they conflated the discrimination that exists within corporate America with the discrimination that exists within educational America. They're two different beasts with two different problems. We can accept in our side of the house there's discrimination inherent to gender roles within corporate America that favors males in the manner he discusses. We understand on our side of the bench, not talking about administrators, but just teachers, that discrimination constantly favors women and creates a negative feedback that leads to inherent discrimination on an even more level playing field. So why is this good to happen in the school arena? We think the school is the perfect place for this. We change social norms all the time within schools, whether it's allowing blacks and whites to be desegregated, or allowing students to wear protesting black bands and make the Vietnam War to their educational arena. Why? Because we stand a far better chance of changing the psychology of a child than we do an older generation. With the most majority of development happens at an educational level. If you as a child are exposed equally to men and women who equally do their job well, regardless of merit in getting that process or getting hired. By the way, being hired doesn't mean you're going to be a good teacher, just pointing that out. But more importantly, we understand that in your development process, you're going to be affected equally by equal representation. We can break the social norm that exists in today's society because we bring that feedback that says women are more naturally better teachers because you're exposed to them more often. Because we recognize the inherent space that exists, we meet the criteria for affirmative action, and we gain all the social benefits opening government told you about. We're proud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the thing about racial integration in the United States is it wasn't the case that there were only 25% of African Americans in certain institutions. It was the case that there were no African Americans. Government's burden isn't just to show you why we should have some men in these positions of authority, but why you can only achieve these goals by having 50% parity rather than the 25% that we currently have today. Because what I would tell you, Mr. Speaker, is that you can actually get a lot of the benefits, particularly the ones that first prop posited, simply by having a number of men around that you don't necessarily need 50%. But I want to engage with the materials we just heard from second proposition and give you our criteria for what is necessary for affirmative action to take place. So first off, we do think there needs to be a systemic discrimination. We agree with the second prop, we just don't think that exists. So why is that the case? First off, note that most other affirmative action programs are not designed with the intention of achieving parity. They're designed with the intention of achieving equal opportunity, right? That's what access to higher education for African Americans in the United States is based on, and all sorts of other things. So that, I think, in second round becomes the question of the debate: is there equal access to opportunity? I'm going to give you a couple of reasons why we think men might be more interested or more inclined to apply, or less interested or less inclined to apply for these positions. First off, men are more likely to be hired and given more money in all sorts of other areas, whether it's politics, whether it's higher education, whether it's business. Given that it's easier for men to get jobs in these areas, it makes sense why fewer men are getting jobs in areas like education. So if you actually have a problem with the system as it exists today, Mr. Speaker, it's not the incentives that exist at the primary and secondary level, but rather the incentives that exist in terms of the access to more meaningful power, like in our political system, like in big business, and things like that. We think we can set more meaningful change in that way. No, thank you. And now, the second thing we would say is that there might be reasons why women are more inclined to apply and hold these positions. Now, not to make a normative statement, but I think it is just, okay, but I think today, women still do predominantly play the role of raising children, in that they're more likely to be stay-at-home mothers than stay-at-home fathers. Why is this important? Because education is one of the few areas where you can work from the same period of time during which your child is at school and not have to make that sacrifice between your work life and raising a family, Mr. Speaker. We think you deny these opportunities to a lot of working class women when all of a sudden you remove those opportunities that exist and start handing them over to men. We think that's a problem. But the second criterion I'll give you is that there has to be a social harm to exclusion. So when you look at things like affirmative action in higher education, we don't do it just because we think intrinsically there's a good for having roughly proportionate racial representation in higher education. We do it because denying access to higher education denies access to economic empowerment, to political empowerment, to all sorts of other, not intrinsic, but the other word, instrumental goods. That's why we do it. I'll take you in a second. So the point here, Mr. Speaker, is that there's no sort of instrumental, I'll talk about it in a second.
The longer you have more women teaching, the more likely you'll have more women thinking they can only teach. Isn't that in itself a harm of exclusion?
Okay, I don't think that happens, because I think you don't need 50% of men in education to break down those stereotypes. I'm going to deal with more of that in reputation. But, so, interestingly, we hear on first proposition that it's simply the lack of men in a particular area that makes men feel uncomfortable. Guess what? If that applies to jobs, it also applies to places like education. So for instance, you might be willing to hire more men to teach these courses, but if men don't feel comfortable going into BEd courses because it's dominated by women and those same stereotypes that we hear about in first proposition, you're not going to get more men seeking that type of education in the first place. And note, I think it is important to note in this debate that if you want the increase from 25% to 50%, as Wudi admits in his first speech, you do have to sacrifice some merit, particularly when there is, you will think you're nodding, so I won't talk about it in a second, Rob. Anyways, so the point here is you have to sacrifice merit, that's bad. Okay, so a couple of other points. We think in response to the argument about what children are comfortable with, it might actually be the case that especially at young ages, children are more uncomfortable with female role models. Because, first off, they're more likely to be raised by women, whether it's their mother or whether it's other caregivers. So making that association in your educational environment can enhance the messages you choose. Second off, just statistically, children are also more likely to be abused by men, right, in positions of power and things like that. So we think based on these ideas, it might be the case that at young ages, you're better able to receive messages from women than you are from men. All right, let's deal with a little bit of repetition. No thanks. So here are a couple of things on second, I'll start with second proposition, then work my way back. So on second proposition we hear about changing social norms and how you lead to a self-selecting process where you intrinsically just look for women in these positions. Look, you don't change that process if everyone considers this to be tokenism and look at the men in these positions, in these teaching positions, and say, you're not there because you deserve to be there, you're there because there is legislation that requires you to be there. That not only delegitimizes the new men that you hire, but it delegitimizes all the men that would have been teachers in the first place, because people can't distinguish between men that are hired under this policy versus men that are hired under the current system based on merit in the first place. So that's a harm for all men that are involved in the process. Now we heard somewhere on proposition, I don't know where, that you need to have a good example of interaction between men and women. Well, guess what? If your colleagues perceive you as being hired only through affirmative action and denying chances to other people of their own gender, they're probably going to not interact with you all too positively in the first place. So I question whether or not this happens. All right, now we heard this idea of social integration changing, integration of races leading to social change in education institutions in the United States. The issue here is that I think that change was far more monumental than anything that they're proposing on proposition, right? Because you're talking about changing an institution that affected everywhere else in society, and you can make a causal link between integrating schools to integration happening in other institutions. But I question the link that happens on under proposition's model between having more men in this particular occupation leading to more opportunities for women in other occupations. So I don't think it leads to a systemic change across areas that we care more about. So if, for instance, access to power, access to big business, all those sorts of other things. We heard this idea of running down proposition that men and women teach differently. I think they take a far too deterministic view of gender. If you even just look at the differences between two particular male teachers or two particular female teachers, they can be huge, right? Sure, it might be the case that there are innate differences between men and women in how we think, but that doesn't mean there have to be innate differences in how we teach. Because if you can understand what those differences are, and they teach you that in teachers' college, right? Men can be taught how to effectively communicate with women. Women can be taught how to effectively communicate with men. The last thing I want to note is that all of their arguments in proposition assume that teachers play a larger role than they actually do. In most inner city schools, teachers work from 9 to 3, they're underpaid, and they don't actually serve as these great role models that they'll have you believe, right? They serve as educators first and educators only. For all these reasons, we are proud to
Sean threw down the gauntlet before us and said, show us that this change will be monumental. Tell us why we need to do this. Take our criteria and do what you can with it. Assail this argument. Right. We understand, obviously as the only American team in this round, and they said in America, thank you, Queens, that there is a crisis within our education system. And what is that crisis? Not only do you have substantially high numbers of children who are not graduating to get the benefits of post-secondary education that opening government alluded to, but we also see that the educational system, that is a public institution, fails totally in its ability to enact social change and stability in the life of a child. If you honestly do not believe that interacting with another person for 6 hours a day, 30 hours a week at the very minimum for the better part of your life is not a substantial impact on who you are as an impressionable human being, then I really fail to see the importance of this debate here. What am I going to do for you today? I'm going to crystallize this debate, coincidentally, since I'm the whip speaker apparently, into 2 questions. What is the importance of schools? And second, what are the benefits to allowing equality of educators? Before I get into any of that, we need to listen to the extension that Sean brought for us today, because he tells you that we need to assent to certain criteria. And one of the things that's been a running tone through the opposition lines today has been that you're going to get backlash, you're going to get tokenism, you're going to be able to have an engendered resentment from other educators, to which we say, 1, sure, we eat those because of the benefits we get, but 2, I really don't give a damn about who that audience they're talking about are. Who's the audience? That child. If that child is able to be positively affected, then that is exactly who I am going for. My job as the government is to look past these societal norms that are attempting to engender that discrimination implicitly inherent within the institution of public education and to serve an iconoclastic function to do that better. But second, he attempts to tell you that the idea of a meritocracy is going to be lowered from this, to which we say, since the system itself already shows that the state has failed in its duty to be able to provide substantive education levels to children, to the point to where substantial amounts of Latinos in southwestern United States, village schools in Alaska, and even inner city cities who have single-parent houses can't buy into the system because they don't have a role model. We see that there's a substantial harm and the state is leaving them out to dry. So we see that the meritocracy at best is improved here. Finally, what he goes on to tell you is that he needs to show us how the idea of women show themselves in a different societal norm and a passive harm from them. To which we say, it's quite interesting that opening and closing opposition want to have their cake and eat it too. Because what they want to tell you is that we really don't think it's relevant for you to say that women and men think better than one another. But then they give you examples such as nurturers, such as mothers who have to stay at home and be educators at the same time. So they're using an example to contravene their own argumentation. Take, for example, the movement within the United States of stay-at-home dads while their women are now their wives and partners are able to go before them. We think that this is a priori and on its face true. Obviously, we see that that is being able to change. But the one institution which is not serving that functional movement is the school education system. Finally, what we hear from Sean is that you talk about the lack of positive reinforcement from having these stereotypes. The fact that you're going to have the idea that men teach a certain way, women teach a certain way, and that by instilling this parity of 50-50, you're not going to be able to get anything from that. To which we say, Mr. Speaker, the absence of parity allows for that assumption to exist. In the absence of that, you allow for those stereotypes to be engendered. Look at exactly what Amie brought to you. It was assumed, it has been a priori, that you were able to say that musicians were composed of better people being men than women. Mr. Malcolm Gladwell spoke before this very university 4 years ago and said just that. And it wasn't that it was an explicit bias. It wasn't as if we didn't have any opportunity. It was an implicit bias we speak of. And that's what we're going to get to today. On to my first question. What is the importance of schools? Before I go on, yes, ma'am.
Okay, so if the system actually didn't negatively discriminate against men, but they were still less present in the system, would you still support this proposition?
No, because I see that there's intrinsic benefits to diversity, 1. And 2, and perhaps more importantly, that assumption that it does not discriminate against men flies in the face of the facts the opposition gave to you. So on both counts, we still carry the day. So we say, what is the importance of schools? Opening and closing government told you, it's a place not only of education, but for instilling some societal benefit to children, setting those societal norms by which you live your adult life. We understand the importance of socialization through that method that goes from there. That's why Amie told you that importance of having that teacher, that presence, that ability to have a human being before you that your eyes cannot corrupt, that teacher is actually a male. You cannot pull back the veneer of what a school book tells you. That is your educator. That is a person that you can bridge that emotional gap with. That is a person with which you can close the disparity of who you are as a human being. That is the societal need of a school system to be so healthy, not just to serve an educational system written with Shakespearean sonnets and mathematical equations, but the ability to engender the flourishing within the soul of a human being who can become an adult. That is why we see such a high burden of confidence. We see that burden is taken nobly by side government today. So second, how do we best benefit from here? And this is what Amie really talked to you about. We see that, yes, in the status quo, men have other alternatives. They have the ability to go to corporate jobs. We own that. We also say, however, that an implicit barrier exists, because not only are you taking a pay cut, but it's not manly of you to be a teacher at the same time. We say to the extent that you can positively enforce the iconoclasm by which you can engender this shift, you get at worst, marginal benefits which go against this idea that you don't have that ability. If you recognize that it is true in the status quo that there is an absence of male leadership in a large portion of households, in vulnerable institutions, mind you, the one function of government is above all to secure the protection of our most vulnerable citizens. Children in poor schools are those people. You need to give them that role model that exists, and we need to serve that function from them as well. If you can engender an incentive for men to come and become part of the school system and to see that that function is not gender specific, you allow for that ability to change. Look at exactly what Amie brought to you about affirmative action. The fact is, we've done it for women as well at the same time, within the professorships that we see. It is a paradigm shift which necessarily means you are attacking a status quo. That means there's conflict. That means there'll be resentment. But the government's job is to find an end which is more beneficial to the status quo. We say that it is absolutely more beneficial to that as well. Because, Mr. Speaker, we see that we must recognize implicit discrimination and inherit the system for what it is, because we see a school's job is to protect its citizens, its children, and to see the flourishing, and because opposition never really gave us a harm, but really said we didn't do enough to help them, we help them at least somewhat better than they do. Vote this motion.
Thanks, Speaker. For remarks, I'd like to call the opposition to the floor to close the round.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, did I walk into that POI? I did. I walked into that POI. But, time, guys. Okay, but the rebuttal still makes some kind of sense, though, right? Because what I was saying is, look, they're trying to make this round about these huge social harms, about stereotypes between men and women. And if I can get them to acknowledge that we're doing a great job fighting those stereotypes, precisely by giving women more opportunities at higher levels, which is what Sean tells you is part of the problem here with men not seeking teaching positions in the first place. If I can convince you that the enormous social battle is broadly being won for women, then I think I have much less of a burden to show you that it must be won here in favor of that greater cause. So when Akis gets up and acknowledges that there's a movement towards having stay-at-home fathers in the United States, this is just another way that you can see that, broadly speaking, we are winning the gender parity battle. We are on the right track. So at that point, the question really does become about whether, on its own merits, this will be good and good enough to be necessary in the context of schools themselves. A couple of questions here. And by the way, because they took the chance to ridicule me, I'm going to ridicule them for something. Because they said, look, like, we are so incensed that in the context of the failure of the U.S. education system, that we would not consider raising the male teaching ratio by 25%, which is largely what that argument comes to. Like, if you can't imagine other reasons why the U.S. education system and you understand education discrimination a lot worse than I thought you did, just on the basis of your arguments about male and female thinking. And by the way, it's like, it's funding, it's like a problem with a curriculum. Okay. Two really broad questions I want to deal with here. One of them is, what are the harms of the status quo really? And the second one is going to be, what are the harms of the affirmative action policy that they're proposing? Really? No thank you. So first of all, what are the harms of the status quo? Their biggest one seems to be, and this is what Second Gov went with, the idea of discrimination against men, the systemic, right? I think if we can prove to you, if we can convince you that that's not the case, we think that that's already done a great deal of harm in their case. Well, I guess we have attitude. Okay. Sean already gets and tells you, look, part of the real problem is there's not all that much interest on the part of men in these kinds of roles, and I think that's right. And apart from that, another problem is that men have better opportunities than women do elsewhere. And that's exactly the battle that we're winning, right? I don't actually think we heard much of a response to that. I think all they did was try to harp on their little imaginary benefits. But they don't address our very good analysis of what the real source of the problem is. All they say is there's systemic discrimination because there are stereotypes, and the stereotypes mean that there are fewer men in these positions. And because there are fewer men in these positions, well, we can conclude that there must necessarily be stereotypes. The reasoning is largely circular to justify the systemic problem. We have another explanation for the systemic problem that doesn't require a circularity of stereotype justification. We have a completely different one that doesn't just rely on its own assertions, and we think it makes a great deal of sense. Again, as I pointed out earlier, right, the reason that we don't see a lot of women pursuing jobs in the oil rig industry is not because they don't, not because there is systemic discrimination against women who apply for oil rig positions. It's because they're not necessarily interested in those jobs, and they have opportunities that they would prefer to take. And this goes back to what Sean was telling you about equality of outcomes versus equality of opportunity. You can't infer from an inequality of outcomes that there must be an inequality of opportunity. We think in any fair economy that allows individual actors to make decisions, you will get disparate outcomes at the end. We think that that doesn't mean there has to be discrimination, and in this case, we don't think it does mean that. Go ahead, Wudi.
So the harm is the large numbers of children who just don't have male role models in their homes. Our first prop model gives you more of a chance, a higher chance to have those in the school system.
Okay, look, I'm going to get there when I get there, but in brief, they have role models. Everybody acknowledges it, right? They have 25% of their teachers who are male role models. What you're arguing for is we really need that 1/4 more. And that's also but I mean it's funny because you guys are like, yeah, that is the point. But you haven't actually done any work to justify the importance of the percentage difference. The only work you've actually done in this round is to justify the necessity of role models in the first place, possibly, not for some kind of sheer numbers idea. I think that's what's really wrong-headed about the approach. Alright, what are some other harms that they cause? Okay, so they do say fewer male role models in schools and less cross-gender interaction. First of all, students see very little of their teachers interacting with each other anyway. I think that's kind of a non-issue. Second of all, fewer role models in schools. Here's a question, right? Because I think this has been what I would call a very conceptual round. And the reason I think that is because, they're relying on all sorts of ideas that are very pretty and it sounds awful. But I would ask you to consult your intuitions for a second, right? Would you or would you not agree with the statement? I was disadvantaged by a lack of male role models in my elementary and high school schooling. I think, honestly, broadly speaking, I can think of male teachers I had. I can't think of reasons I was upset. I can't think of effects it had on my life. I think these are all trumped up problems that they've invented to justify their position, when really, there is no problem. You do have role models. Apart from which, look, we live in an age where it is more possible to have a vast variety of role models than ever before. Based on the internet, based on the wide variety of media that are accessible. I mean, no, it's easy, but it's true. If you have problems coming to grips with maleness in this world, you have recourses that you've never had before. You have access to all sorts of role models in society. And if anything, the real problem is still a lack of female role models, broadly speaking. So I don't think there's a real problem there. I don't think they've shown you there are real harms. They've just posited these mysterious harms of having 1/4 role models who are male as opposed to 50%. And Sean lays that burden for them, and they do not rise to meet it at any point. What are some harms that you actually get here? Oh yeah, and also the lack of male thinking style. I think that's ridiculous. There's always more variation within the group of males or females than variation between the two groups inherently. Like I've looked at the statistics too. Okay. What are the harms of the affirmative action? Everybody here acknowledged you will get less qualified teachers. And because the pool is so much smaller, you will get significantly less qualified teachers. The real problem with their case here is that it posits that that 25% that they think is so important is somehow more important than having as qualified teachers for our children as we can possibly have. That's what's wrong with it. That's why we win.
Guys, hold on for a second before you get up and go. When you leave, can you please take, just to help us out, the chair that you are sitting on and move it to the debates room so everyone can sit?
Can I get one person from each school